The global economy is in an age of confusion.
I think that at the moment, we're at the time of revolutionary upheaval. Our famous quote, the old order is dead and the new is struggling to be born.
Trade wars, tariffs, an AI boom that's reshaping markets. And just as the world seemed to be finding its post-pandemic footing, the ground shifted again.
And it remains that basically made people believe that the people in charge were corrupt and incompetent.
The post-war order, the institutions the U.S. built and led, is changing. China has emerged as a genuine rival with the resources and ambition to match. Populism is reshaping politics across the West, and the result is a world that feels less predictable, less secure, and far harder to govern.
The sort of idea that the way to manage the world is through international organizations which operate through consensus, they operate multilaterally, which was, I think, part of the US promise. It was never fully realized. That's gone because the US doesn't believe in it.
So what explains this moment? Can the US and China coexist without destabilizing everything? Where do tariffs and industrial policy actually help, and where do they make things worse? And is there any framework that can bring order to this era of uncertainty?
Where this will end up, I have no idea, but if I may put it this way, it frightens the hell out of me.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the economy in an age of confusion. Joining us today is Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times and author of The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. He was awarded Commander of the British Empire for services to financial journalism, has been named to Foreign Policy's list of top 100 global thinkers, and is widely regarded as one of the world's most influential voices on the global economy. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
Countries in the global south was a central concern. At the same time, very high public debt and rising servicing costs are becoming really major issues in both the US, I know for sure, and the UK. So how would you characterize the global debt landscape right now? And what do you think we should understand about the different types of debt challenges that are facing advanced versus emerging economies and some of the implications of just what's happening in the debt world?
Well, this really is a very complicated question, and there are some aspects that I'm following more closely than others. The debt in across the world is close to peak levels relative to world GDP. It's a bit variable. A peak was reached during the pandemic. Since then, there have been some declines. But they're not really significant, at least not in the big countries. In general, the situation of public sectors is different from that of private sectors. There are different drivers going on there. That depends, of course, on the country. And of course, the situation of countries that are easily able to borrow in their own currencies and have credible public debt managerial capacity is very, very different from the position of the countries you mentioned, particularly in the developing world, more than in the, and here you can actually make a distinction increasingly between what we think of as classic developing countries together, really relatively poor countries, which, if they're going to borrow internationally, have to borrow in foreign currencies, and the emerging economies, which have been increasingly good at borrowing in their own currencies. They're not easily able, but they're much more easily able than they used to be to borrow in their own currencies internationally. because there are foreign demand for their currencies too, but they can borrow very, very comfortably in their domestic currencies if they want to. So China doesn't have, as an extreme example, any problems in borrowing. It has access to the largest pool of savings in the world, which is domestic, and it runs a huge current account surplus. So it's fine from a debt point of view, except for domestic debt problems. And domestic debt problems are always very different from international ones, because in the last resort, governments can rescue domestic debtors if they want to, and governments can, of course, access, if they're creditworthy, their own debt markets in their own currency. It makes a lot of difference. So I would say, with that pretty important background, there are clearly a lot, mostly of smaller developing countries, notably in Africa, which were very badly damaged by the pandemic. Their economies are weak. Unfortunately, extreme poverty is not continuing to decline as it was. And they have huge pressures from their young and relatively poor populations for spending, difficult to raise taxes. Aid is being cut very sharply by most countries, including, for example, my own. And they have become very dependent, again, on borrowing in foreign currencies. That always means relatively high interest rates because they're not seen as very creditworthy. And many of them now are facing very severe debt difficulties. It's a very complicated story, but it's very, very clear from recent work with the World Bank that this is a very big issue. Many of the emerging economies, the bigger ones anyway, are okay. I mean, take India, for example. It's not facing serious debt constraints. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Pakistan has had very big debt problems. It has to be rescued. The IMF is there. Of course, it's very dependent on China. Here we start getting into very specific countries with very specific problems. There are a lot of countries that borrow from China that have had difficulties. Sri Lanka and Zambia are both noted cases. There are a lot of complexity there. I won't go further into that because we can use up the whole half hour. On the developed countries, well, the big story is no developed country, major or even small developed country, is close to a debt crisis now. They're all able to borrow at reasonable terms, but interest rates have risen a lot since the pandemic. We are no longer in anything close to zero rates, so the cost of borrowing is high. Many of the countries are running pretty large fiscal deficits, and the most important one that is doing so is the US. And that's very concerning because the dollar is so important and the dollar interest rates are so important. And I would say there's no crisis here, but there is a long-standing building debt problem. Because any plausible view of the future, and I wrote about that actually today, shows debt continue to rise. And that's partly because there's already so much debt and it's expensive. It's partly because of aging and the cost pressures of aging. It's partly because there's increasing pressure to spend on defense. It's partly because in many countries, growth is slower than it used to be. By the way, that is also true of the US, though it's not done as badly as other places. So I think of this not as a crisis in any sense, but as a long-running ailment, which on any plausible view is going to get worse. And that suggests that at some point, we have to discuss it in detail, they're going to have problems dealing with it. There are also large parts of the private sector around the world which are highly indebted, and there are always connections between highly indebted private sectors and government sectors. But in general, outside China, which has had a huge build-up debt, private sector debt problems, this is a complicated, are somewhat better than immediately before the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9. It's a very quick summary of this unbelievably complicated situation.
Well done on that, and thank you. And so it's nice to know that at least in the U.S., this is more of a chronic condition that needs to be managed properly than, an acute crisis.
Chronic conditions can become critical unexpectedly, and there I wrote today about possible ways in which it could go critical. you never know quite how these accumulations of debt and the very complicated structure of modern debt markets, which are quite different from the way they used to be, will interact. And you could suddenly find that there's a loss of confidence in the US dollar, a collapse in the currency is possible. I'm not predicting it. Then the Fed would have to raise rates, or if not, inflation starts shooting up. Either way, that could be very destabilizing, but I'm not forecasting it within a reasonable period. It's just a risk out there. And at the moment, I think a manageable one, but the next chair of whoever the next chair of the Fed is might have an exciting life.
Well, let's see. And for those listening, we actually held a conversation last week on the role of the dollar. Just shifting gears a little bit, if I understand correctly, you started studying economics as a means of understanding politics. So I'd like to switch a little bit to the crisis of democratic capitalism, where you argue that our political dysfunction is deeply rooted in economic forces. So looking at the US and the UK today, both very polarized societies, a lot of polarized politics, discontent, populism, how much of the current political moment do you see as fundamentally being economic? And are these similar forces driving political shifts either to the right or to the left in other parts of the world?
I think this is a fascinating question, much more complicated than the one we've discussed, and that was bad enough. I think, let me separate out, sort of talk a little bit about where I am now in terms of where I've been. So I'm a child of refugees who came from continental Europe before the Second World War. They were Jewish, they were Jews, and they fled for their lives, basically. And they survived, their immediate family survived, but their wider families were all killed. Now, that inevitably, growing up as a child with foreign parents who were refugees, no other family in the country, you were aware of this. And I was very well aware of what had happened in Europe. And I came to the view in my adolescence, really, that obviously part of what triggered Nazism and the breakdown was the Great Depression. And that's become more and more obvious to me. So that is part of the reason I wanted to study economics. More broadly, I wanted to understand the obviously gigantic role economics plays in politics, because our societies, and I have not changed my view at all, have to a very considerable extent been built on the proposition over the last 2 centuries, but particularly the last century or so, on the proposition that people are going to get better off all the time. And that's completely revolutionary in the sense that before about 1800, no one had thought that was a possibility. It's just not what happened. Basically, economic conditions at the end of people's lives were much like what they were at the beginning of people's lives. So on a generational basis, it didn't matter. But we offer people the opportunity and the hope of being well off, getting better off, and avoiding huge crises. And I think that became a core part of our political promise. And if you look at the political debates in America or Britain, really over the last, going back throughout the 19th century, but certainly by the late 19th century through the 20th and 21st century so far, much of the politics has been about economics in all sorts of different ways. But of course it has. And because that's about how people live. And so one reason, I think, for the disenchantment with our politics, and that's a core part of my book, was longer-term economic failures, rising inequality, deindustrialization, profound shifts in relative economic position of men versus women, all sorts of things which shook a lot of people's trust in the quote-unquote economic justice of the system. And then along came this gigantic financial crisis. And my view is, and it remains, that basically made people believe that the people in charge were corrupt and incompetent. And that led them to think we should get somebody completely new who could deliver us from this problem. Now, of course, when people like the populist leaders that then tend to emerge, they have to have a narrative. And we know very well, because this was very much what happened in the 30s, as again I point out, that people look at, they sort of look to blame people whom people can easily identify as responsible for what this happened. It's because, to put it bluntly, a lot of the people who actually do have genuine power and might even be responsible for a lot of this want to divert the blame. And that's pretty obvious. And so this tends to generate two phenomena which are linked. A politics of us against them. And the politics of us and them shifts the blame in large part from large parts of the elite to outsiders, and the whole slew of outsiders, foreigners, obviously, minorities, people who think differently, have strange ideas, and all the rest of it. That tends to be part of the politics when the sense of confidence in democracy as us goes. And I think what we are seeing is an interaction between economic frustration and anger and that sort of politics. And that sort of politics, as we know, does pretty well. And the more ignorant, and there are systems for keeping people ignorant, people are about what's going on underneath, the more likely that form of politics is to emerge, and it tends to be anti-democratic. So my view, it is a bit lengthy, is that the economics and the politics tend to interact in complex, unpredictable, and from the point of view of somebody like me, rather irrational ways, but that doesn't matter. Obviously, in the retrospect, the promises that Adolf Hitler, and I'm not comparing him directly with anyone now, made for improving the position of the German people were complete nonsense, but a lot of people bought it. And they bought it by his emphasizing, in response to his emphasizing the we, the us, against the enemies within. Well, I think it's not very difficult to see parallels between that sort of politics then and what we're seeing in much of the world, including my own country and certainly in the US today.
And do you see anything emerging from this? I mean, I know there's a lot of talk, at least in the geopolitical side of things, about, the end of the, post-World War II liberal world order. On the economic front, are we returning to some pre-World War II stage, or are we entering something totally new that has a mix of, all different systems that came before? Is there any sort of emerging order that you see happening?
I think that's an immensely important question. I think that at the moment we're at the time of revolutionary upheaval, or rather, famous quote: "The old order is dead, and the new is struggling to be born." So I don't think we see the new. Now, when I say the old order is dead, that can be seen in many different ways. But there are at least two or three obvious ways. The old institutions of the multilateral economic system, predominantly the systems created by the US with its allies after the war, which at first were really the systems of the West. Then quite a few developing and emerging countries got attached to it. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, they became global. They were seen as global. And that system is clearly breaking down. And it's breaking down mostly because the US is not interested in it anymore. And that's particularly true in the trade area. It's also in development cooperation, though this is a much more recent one. Multilateral approaches to climate are also gone. The sort of idea that the way to manage the world is through international organizations which operate through consensus. They operate multilaterally, which was, I think, part of the US promise. It was never fully realized. That's gone because the US doesn't believe in it. And I think it was already somewhat clear with the first Trump administration and with the Biden administration, but under the current administration, it's completely obvious. They have absolutely no interest in any of the concepts underlying this system. This is, of course, reinforced by the second big change, that for the first time in US history since, let's say, the late 19th century, there is a peer rival in the world, a superpower in some ways bigger than America, obviously with enormous resources and potential, technologically increasingly powerful, which operates in the world system, but also is obviously not fully committed to any sort of liberal order in all truth. So in this system, this power system, we have a breakdown in international relations. This is occurring partly as a result of that, alongside a period of a large amount of international disorder in both the economic and political sphere, including wars, of course, again, not unheard of. But I think this amounts to a comprehensive breakdown of the order that was established after the Second World War. But I think there's something deeper going on, and it is worth stressing that. At least my view is that you can see it in the US, but you can also see it in other Western countries. There is actually a reaction against even deeper parts of modern Western culture. And by that, I mean a reaction against the Enlightenment and Enlightenment principles, a reaction against the idea of the rule of law, as opposed to, let's bluntly, monarchical ways of governing, a reaction against many of the ideas, egalitarian ideas that we've lived with and believed in the last 100 years. I mean, genuine reactionary movements, which are embrace nationalist, xenophobic ideas of the sort we've seen before the war. And they are now in core countries of the liberal revolution, of the American Constitution, I think in certain important ways is at stake. So I think what's going on now includes very definitely this breakdown of the post-war order, but because of the disappointment of people with what's happening, this is culminating in, or showing signs of, being an anti-democratic revolution. And the democratic idea, the liberal and democratic ideas, which we came to some sort of fruition in the last century or so, of course, had their roots already in the beginning, in the 17th century. So this is a very big process. Where this will end up, I have no idea. But if I may put it this way, it frightens the hell out of me.
Well said. Thank you. You brought up China. You've recently said in a conversation that you're long on China, albeit sadly because of its technological dynamism, because you see, as you just referenced, the Western alliance system weakening. So at a time when narratives about China, they seem to range from decline and stagnation to resurgent superpower, what informs your read of China's actual trajectory economically, technologically, et cetera? And what do you think we tend to, and by we, I mean the US, the UK, most misunderstand about where China is heading?
Well, I would have to emphasize that I always say this. It will be crazy for me to claim expertise on China. All I can say is I've been there more or less every year. and talked to people since 1993. I've read a lot, but I don't read Mandarin, so I ought to speak it. I have many Chinese friends whom I regard as wonderful and brilliant. And of course, I thought it's the most important story of my lifetime. As an economist, as somebody interested in development, somebody interested in politics, this is the most remarkable story of my lifetime. So, but I emphasize my ignorance. I think the ignorance is widely shared. Now, the second, including not by all, but many people who think they're experts, the second point is one has to make some judgments. So in the late 70s, it was very easy to conclude that China was never going to be important. If you looked at China in 1978 or 1980, yes, it's a big country, but it's incredibly poor and backward. It's not going to go anywhere. That would have been a very, very serious mistake. So my starting point for thinking about China is not to think about what policies they're following now. We can come to that in a second. What's going on now, though that's very important, but to consider the potential and ambitions of the place. And the thing to remember is it is a declining population slowly, but it's 1.4 billion people. They are fantastically capable and committed to learning and to and what they've achieved already in the last 40 years, if you think, is simply unbelievable. It's stupendous. They have moved to the forefront of technology, developed an incredibly sophisticated economy from nothing, really. So you can't underestimate them. They have some very deep problems. Many of the problems are created by the way the political system works, which is important, particularly now. It's become more centralized, more control-oriented than before, which I think is an economic problem, though I understand why it's happened. And they have some really very significant imbalances in this economy, which are partly a function of that political system. At the moment, as a result of making some very big mistakes, I think, which I've written about for the last 20 years, I started writing about this long before Xi Jinping became the leader. They have made some big mistakes, and as a result, growth has slowed more than it should have done, but they're still innovating like mad. Then, so we look at the head. You rightly say it. Some people would say, if you look at the trajectory of the Chinese economy over the last 15 years, the growth has slowed very, very sharply. They're probably overestimating or over-reporting it now. The growth might really be 3 or 4% now. That's very questionable, but some people would say lower. I am not convinced of that at all. And therefore, they basically sort of lost it, and they'll never pass America. I don't believe this, but I don't believe this because of any analysis of the economy. I believe their economic problems are fixable if the political system, I've written about this many times, is sufficiently adaptable. And my bet is that if the Chinese actually work out that they are no longer growing at 4 or 5%, say, which would be roughly twice America. I mean, so still getting bigger. My guess is that one way or another, the system will adapt and change to ensure they can. And I have no doubt they have the potential, none, to grow faster than that, as fast as that. And I think actually faster. If you look at the human resources, the incredible savings and investment rate, how well they're doing in international competition, the way the US is destroying its own alliances. I mean, from their point of view, the objective situation is one in which they can grow faster because crucially, while they're a big, huge economy, in real GDP per head terms, they're only a third of US levels. They don't have to get above half. And the economy is much bigger than America's. So my view is, if you look at the potential, look at what they've achieved, recognize the genuine problems and the mistakes they've made, his question ultimately is the bet you make that the Chinese will not solve those problems and will go downhill and become like Russia under Brezhnev, or is your bet that the Chinese will solve these problems and come back? And I think the shrewd bet And I suspect the sensible bet anyway, because we don't know, is that they actually will solve these problems and they're going to continue to rise. And I think it's dangerously complacent for Western powers to believe otherwise. And if I add this, it is therefore very foolish of the US in particular, which has a quarter of China's population, to assume that in this competition with China, it needs no allies. I think this is a very profound mistake, and that's the mistake I think that America has now made. And so I am, for all these reasons, I've now spelled it out in detail, bullish on China.
Thank you. And my final question, which I feel like is a good one to end on, but might be a big question. We see significant price bubbles in most asset classes, driven in part by significant polarization of wealth, as this wealth needs to find a home, usually in financial assets. Social tension is unsurprisingly rising. Should we try to avoid the revolutionary change which often follows? And if so, how?
Well, I think that's a reasonable description, though I would have to say that there have been lots of bubbles in the past. They usually cause inequality. Whether they're caused by inequality is a more complicated question. But obviously, if you have very rapidly rising asset prices, particularly equities, well, in every country, the equities are always owned, predominantly owned by a relatively small portion of the population. Of course, they get richer. I mean, that is inevitable. Now, it looks to me at the moment that what's going to follow this period is a counter-revolution, not a revolution. It's, of course, equally revolutionary, but it's essentially the promise, this is historically very common with reactionary political movements, is, I quote, to make America great again. The again is, I think, the most important word there, i.e., it's nostalgic. And very often in deeply troubled time, not always at all, but that's another question, what sometimes one and sometimes the other. But often in deeply troubled times, the desire of the people who feel they're doing badly, often people who've been in the middle and feel they're sliding to the bottom, and that's a core part of my book. This fear of downward mobility is nostalgia, to go back to what they thought it was like when they were children. Often there's other elements here, the nostalgia of young men for a world they never saw. That's another subject. But a part of it is the desire to go back. Now, that can be quite revolutionary. There's no doubt reactionary movements with that sort of focus are revolutionary in the sense they undo much of what has happened more recently. And we in Europe, because of what happened in the 20s and 30s, are very, very well aware of that story. But interestingly, if I look at the politics of America, of Europe, that's what I see. The left looks sort of left revolution, egalitarian revolution, and seem to be essentially a parlor game for scholars and academics. They're not majority movements. Yes, they seem to be more provocative, but if I look at the new mayor of New York, he's not a revolutionary. I mean, really, what he's promising by the standards of real revolutions is no more than mildly updated social democracy. So what is striking to me, if you compare it with the first part of the 20th century, when there were communists everywhere, I mean, real communists, they aren't there anymore. So it's a reactionary stage. Is there anything we can do to stop that? Well, I'd hoped that we could do that by having more successful modernizing policy of the type we've discussed in the case of, for instance, dealing with demography. I seem to have been unsuccessful in that. Maybe it's too complicated or I'm too arrogant. But that was the theme of my book, that we had to make today better. We can't go back to yesterday. That's obvious. And the world of some completely imaginary future that has never existed, we tried that in the 20th century with the communist movements and they failed. Try to make today better. But apparently that doesn't sell well. And that is, to me, very, very depressing. But I don't want revolution. I don't think it'll come from the left. I think we're getting reactionary revolutions from the right, and that will be hell.
Well, on that positive note, thank you for joining us again, Martin. It's just such a privilege to talk to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Martin, it's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. You asked such wonderful questions.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.